square and said of course he did. He said steadily and slowly, Christ would have gone to see his mother first, but his mother would have kept that special intercession with her son in her heart. So strong was his faith, so steady was his guidance, so resolute was his standing at the head and being the shepherd of the church, and how greatly he will be missed.
Alistair Bruce speaking to us from Sky Centre in London. We thank you for those thoughts. Let's take our cue, shall we, from the Polish flag you pointed out amongst the congregation at St. Peter's tonight, and take ourselves over to Krakow in Poland, where Pope John Paul is being remembered with similar events. Services, candles have been lit, bells are tolling, and silence is maintained. Reporting live, Anna Botting. Anna?
Yes, Martin, thanks very much indeed. Even now there is singing taking place at a vigil which has been going on now for some 30 hours. In one of the main churches, Santa Maria, it's actually packed to the rafters. They're taking communion there. And outside the rest of the churches here in Krakow, candles have been lit, most of them in the shape of crosses, one in the shape of a heart. They so loved Pope John Paul II. Karol Wojtyła, who was born a short distance from here 84 years ago. Also this evening we have found out that the Polish government has said there will be a period of national mourning, and that will last right up until the funeral, so beyond the dates already set in Italy, which is some 3 days. Across Poland there have been memorials going on as soon as the information came through, and at the vigil that I mentioned here in Krakow there were extraordinary scenes. A couple of people fell instantly to their knees. They were presumably listening on radio. The Catholic Church here set up its very own radio station in order to inform the faithful of the latest. As they fell to the knees, word passed around the group of what was happening, and gradually all of the hundreds of people who were stood there fell to their knees. A couple of people passed out. One was taken to hospital as the priest came out and confirmed that Pope John Paul II had died. Let's get the very latest now from the streets of Krakow and hear from Sky's Lawrence Lee, who reports on the passing of the man the Poles called Our Father.
Tonight, all Krakow, all Poland are in tears. They'd spent another day and another evening praying for him, but when the news came, they still had no way of dealing with it.
People are very sad. I saw a few people was crying, a lot of people was crying. And a few people, I think I saw lost the consciousness. It's very sad. Every people pray and pray.
More and more arrived beneath the Archbishop's palace, where he served and returned time and again to bless his people. The crowd swelled to at least 10,000, and yet hardly anyone could bring themselves to speak. Physical pain was ignored, or perhaps not even noticed. They simply can't believe he's gone. He was their ideal in so many ways, not only as God's representative on earth, but as the man who lionized Poland throughout the 20th century against Nazism, against communism. He was our Pope, said one man to me tonight. There are no words. Which in turn leads to the new question of how this country, which has relied on his spiritual and political guidance for so long, can now move on. And so they made for home to the sound they never wanted to hear, the cathedral bells ringing out the news of John Paul's passing. Surely he wouldn't have wanted them to suffer so much on his behalf, and yet tonight it feels like they may never recover. Lawrence Lee, Sky News, Krakow in Poland.
Well, the bells are still tolling here in Krakow as all Poland remembers Pope John Paul II. Let's get the thoughts of those in Ireland now and speak to Archbishop Sean Brady, Primate of all Ireland. Thank you very much indeed for joining us this evening. There is great heartache in Poland. What are your thoughts and the thoughts of the people of Ireland this evening?
Well, the bells are tolling here in St. Patrick's Cathedral, Armagh, as we mourn with heavy hearts the loss of a great leader. The people have been turning out throughout these days in to pray for the Holy Father, and they came again tonight at 11 o'clock to recite the Rosary of the Virgin Mary, which was one of his favourite prayers. We are full of sadness, of course, at the great loss which has befallen our church, but it's also a day of gratitude for the wonderful gifts which he brought to the leadership of our church and which he used so generously up until his last breath, teaching us not alone how to live but also how to die. And so there's a mixture of pride. He also had hoped to come back to Ireland and to come to Northern Ireland, and in particular to Armagh. So there's our thoughts are tinged with sadness on that in that area also. But we remember with great affection the visit of the Holy Father and all his great leadership and teaching qualities. He was a man of great warmth and love, a great courageous leader, a joyful man who rejoiced in nature and in God's creation and in God's work everywhere he found it.
Yes, and a warm face he had too. Do you think that his legacy will be so lasting because he was so accessible to the people, that he really did travel the world to try to meet as many faithful as he could?
Yes, indeed. I think that was one of the things he set before himself, to travel the world. When he became Pope, he said to the people who came from the delegations of various countries that he thought the only real human progress could be made through unity and cooperation. And he certainly set out to play his part in unifying the world. And he went to all those countries and spoke the languages and greeted the people with tremendous enthusiasm and zest and respect for people. And in that sense, he was everybody's Pope. And that's why it's so edifying to find so many nations of the world. We had China, Africa, all the many continents, people united in prayer for him these days, but also in sadness and in sorrow. So that's one of his great legacies, this dialogue which he set up, not just among Christian churches, but among the different faiths, and indeed among people of no faith.
Archbishop, I know here in Poland that every time he came to visit, 1 million, 2 million turned out to see him, and I believe it was in the Philippines where he had his biggest audience of some 4 million people. Why were the faithful so keen to come and pay their respects and to see him in the flesh?
Well, I think they recognized a man of God, a man who prayed, a man who also placed his great talents at the service of the Lord, who called him to the highest office in the Catholic Church. And he just related to people because he had this great respect for people that he wanted to reach out. And I was in Rome for many years and saw him at audiences where he was particularly keen to reach out to the sick and the elderly and the newlyweds, and not just clerics and people like that, but to everybody. And he welcomed, and above all, he gave of his time so generously. When he came to Ireland, he spent the whole day. It was after midnight when he got finally sitting down to have a meal. He was so keen to give of himself, meeting people, so that people recognized that generosity and responded, and they felt he belonged to them because he did so much for them.
Well, Archbishop Sean Brady, Primate of all Ireland, we really appreciate your time and talking to us here on this difficult evening. Thank you very much indeed.
Anna, just a thought, if we may share them across Europe, myself broadcasting live from Rome tonight and you in Poland. The Polish people, we know from your reports earlier, had braced themselves for this news, but I get a sense from your reports and what you've been saying that the actual moment of death still came as something of a shock to them.
Yes, a shock to them. I think from what you were saying there in Rome, that people had come to St. Peter's Square to pay their respects to the man they knew to be dying. Here, I think it was quite different. They simply did not accept. They would not prepare for something that they didn't want to happen. To the people of Poland, he is their father, he is their friend, he is their neighbour, he is one of them. He's a man who started from extremely humble beginnings. He's a working class man who rose to the highest levels in the Catholic Church, and this is a deeply Catholic country. More than 90% of the people here are Catholic, and it's a faith that has given Poland its national identity. They were so desperate for him not to go. They were praying for a miracle this evening, and they feel deep pain at his passing.
We've been reflecting, Anna, haven't we, on a number of occasions, and asking our interviewees about the tremendous success this Pope had with the youth of the world, and perhaps that phenomenon being appreciated by the young people was never more acute or never more evident in Poland.
Yes, absolutely, and I have to say, down at the vigil that has been taking place below the apartment where he came to stay on his visits to Krakow, there were children in tears. Children had been taken there by their parents, and they were almost wailing. They felt the grief as much as them, and those are almost toddlers. But certainly the young people would often stand outside that apartment on the days when he returned to Poland, as he did on 9 occasions since 1978, and they would simply stand there, look up at that window and wait for him to turn up, hoping that he'd give some sort of impromptu mass to them or speak to them. As you say, he had a great affinity with young people. He began World Youth Day. He took that around the globe. He brought it here to Poland in 1991. And certainly the figures here in Poland for young people being baptized has risen over the last few years because of Pope John Paul II. And many young people here have only ever known a Polish Pope, and it's going to be very difficult for them to come to terms with the fact that is not so anymore.
Anna, we thank you and the Sky team in Poland, and we will of course be returning there during this Divine Mercy Sunday for further coverage. For the moment, we're just going to return to the pictures coming from St. Peter's, from the area around the Basilica. This is Vatican Television providing these pictures, both occasionally concentrating on that wider picture with the hugely impressive colonnades, as if the Basilica itself wasn't massive and jaw-droppingly beautiful in the way it stands here, so proud in this part of Rome, and the colonnade around each side embracing the masses that gather beneath. That scene we are seeing from time to time. The cameras focus in on clergy or nuns leading the faithful in their prayers and guiding them in their thoughts. As it's now quite late into the night here in Rome this Sunday, many people perhaps now making their way away from the square, ready to prepare for a routine visit to church, which will be, I would suggest, probably far from routine tomorrow morning. Many churches here in Rome preparing to throw their doors open and expecting record attendances as people focus on paying their last respects to Pope John Paul II. Now let's just see if we can bring you some coverage. I mentioned at an earlier part of this particular broadcast some of the comments from world leaders. Let's hear them through their own words, and let's focus on the man who has been guiding Catholics in central London through this difficult couple of days. From Westminster Cathedral, we heard from Cardinal Cormac Murphy O'Connor. This is what he had to say.
He was an extraordinary man, one of the greatest popes in the Church's 2,000-year history. We will remember him for his witness to hope and to the dignity of human life. We'll remember him for his extraordinary energy, for reaching across boundaries of religion and race. We'll remember him for his endurance of suffering, even to the very end. And we'll remember him, and I think the whole world should remember him, for reminding us tirelessly that this world is not the only world, that there's a world to come, our eternal destiny. Pope John Paul, as I have said, was an extraordinary man. And in remembering him, we'll remember that he stood for something very profound. That the light, and for him the light was Christ, was always at its brightest when the darkness of the world seemed very, very deep. The Church will miss him. The world will miss him. And I will miss him. May John Paul.
I will miss him, the words of Cardinal Cormac Murphy O'Connor. We recorded that outside Westminster Cathedral a little earlier this evening. You could hear the bell was tolling there, as indeed other bells have been tolling around the world, none least the bells of the Basilica, which have been ringing out from time to time over Rome. Alistair Bruce is still watching events with us in London. Alistair, let me just share with our viewers some of the thoughts of people who've been writing to us to perhaps set our minds on these thoughts from Rosie in Birmingham, who wrote to us a little earlier. May God now care and look after the Holy Father as he has done for so many. From Christian Fagan in Dublin, the Pope has got me through many years of personal suffering in my life, but knowing he's in heaven looking down over the world may prove more powerful. I don't think the world is fully aware of his greatness yet. May God bless him on his journey. And this comment from Jean Brown in Manchester, who says, I've been viewing the decline of Pope John Paul II with great sadness. He's a great man of utter sincerity and goodness, and the world will be a poorer place without his example. Alistair, I guess the man himself, if he were able to hear our broadcast, would be flattered beyond measure by such comments. He would claim himself unworthy of them and encourage us to think of perhaps happier things.
Well, I think it's extremely moving to see how many people have indeed got in touch with Sky News in the last few hours. A large number of them by mobile phone, just expressing how they feel and in a cathartic way, expressing, I suppose, at this late hour to us, for us to read exactly how they feel, perhaps hearing this news for the first time when they may be on their own or they may just be returning home from something. And it's very expressive to get so many messages. I think that also, looking at this incredible building, which in itself has so many messages, it speaks of, in its all, the symbolism that is carved into the stone and in what was being built by Michelangelo. When Bramante created the design of this cathedral, he wanted to give an example of how huge this church was in representing the Roman Catholic faith. And there were bells too that were added, the bells that were here to ring out and express exactly what is the calling all to prayer, calling all to understand the forgiveness that is in the church. And on this Divine Mercy Sunday, when so many people were hearing such tragic news the Saturday evening before that we've just heard of Pope John Paul II's death, here in this square, looking up at the apartments where he died, it is with their rosaries that they were able to reflect and to quietly pray, because prayer has always been what Pope John Paul II conveyed as the route towards understanding the suffering of Christ and better comprehending the meaning of the Church. And there the flag of Poland flying amongst so many who were here. And it is an incredible place that has seen so much of the history of the Roman Catholic Church, looked down upon by Christ, this imposing figure right above the west door and right above the balcony where the Pope has always appeared on Easter days, and for the first time this year was not able to do that. But all around the world, people have gathered in order to contribute to this moving event. And Martin, I think that in every respect, we can salute this 263rd Pope for the way in which he has led the Church and the way in which he has given guidance to so many believers for 26.5 years.
Alistair, thank you very much indeed for those words. Alistair Bruce speaking us to from Sky Centre in London. Let's just tell you of the details that have been shared with us from the Vatican tonight. They say the Pope's final hours were marked by uninterrupted prayer. He died just at 23 minutes to 9 o'clock. A few details have been released of what's going to happen now. The Cardinals of the Catholic Church will be meeting on Monday morning, their first congregation since the death of the Pope. They're going to discuss the details of his funeral at that time. We do know that on Monday afternoon the Pope's body will be brought to St. Peter's Basilica from the Apostolic Apartments just adjacent to that magnificent building. It's going to lie in state there. For the date of the funeral, well, we are not aware, perhaps before that meeting of the cardinals, exactly when that will be, but already there is conjecture here, not confirmed by the Vatican at this stage. One Italian news agency is reporting this will not happen before Thursday. One newspaper is suggesting it will happen on Wednesday. When we know more, of course, we'll share that information with you. But let's take a moment now, shall we, to reflect on the life and times of Pope John Paul II with my colleague Alex Rossi.
Image of what a pope should be, but it's an image created by John Paul II. Before him, pontiffs were largely remote, aloof figures confined within the walls of the Vatican. But John Paul II was a new pope for a new age. He became one of the most famous faces in the world, using his celebrity to further his mission as he visited more than 100 countries, circling the globe over 30 times. The desire to expand and protect the Catholic Church had its roots in hardship. Karol Wojtyła was born in the small town of Wadowice near Krakow. He spent his childhood in this house, now a museum. They were difficult years. His mother died when he was just 9. His brother 3 years later. In 1939, when he was in his late teens, his native Poland was invaded by the Germans. He'd already chosen to go into the church, but under the Nazi occupation had to conduct his studies in secret at an underground seminary. After the war, Poland became a communist country, and the young priest struggled to maintain his religion in an officially atheist state. Showing the determination that was to become his hallmark, he rose swiftly through the Catholic hierarchy. Nevertheless, his election to the papacy in 1978 was unexpected for a number of reasons. He was the first pontiff from behind the Iron Curtain, an appointment which sent shockwaves through the Soviet Empire. He was also the first non-Italian pope in over 400 years, and at 58, the youngest in a century. His relative youth and active lifestyle earned him the nickname God's Athlete. In the coming years, he was to draw heavily on these physical reserves. John Paul's papacy was almost ended in 1981 when a would-be assassin shot him in St. Peter's Square. An amateur cameraman captured the moment 4 bullets struck the pontiff. So grave were his injuries, he received the last rites. His recovery was viewed by many as miraculous. John Paul put it down to divine intervention, claiming the hand of Our Lady guided the bullets away from his vital organs. He later went to prison to offer forgiveness to the man who'd tried to kill him. The Pope never regained his former physical strength, but resumed his work with undiminished determination. Never fearing controversy, he gave his full support to the fledgling Solidarity movement in his native Poland. When he returned home in 1991 after the fall of communism, it was to a hero's welcome. The Pope's commitment to peace was long-standing. On a trip to Ireland early in his papacy, and well before the peace process had got underway, he issued this appeal.
On my knees, I beg you to turn away from the path of violence and to return to the ways of peace.
When he visited the UK in 1982, he was the first pope to set foot on British soil for 450 years, heralding a new era of interdenominational cooperation. South Africa was another country on the papal itinerary, but on his insistence only after the apartheid regime had been removed.
To say the visit is long overdue is to pay tribute to your own abhorrence of the system of apartheid.
More recently, he was at the forefront of opposition to the war against Iraq, telling both Tony Blair and President Bush it was a failure of humanity. But many who admired the Pope's commitment to political freedom were less impressed by his unyielding stance on matters of doctrine. His views on the ordination of women, abortion, contraception and homosexuality were unapologetically conservative. Many liberal Catholics regarded his reaction to the paedophile scandal which rocked the church in America as too little, too late.
Well,
As he wrestled with the problems of making the church relevant in the new millennium, John Paul II embarked on a symbolic pilgrimage to the Holy Land. On the 2000th anniversary of the birth of Christ, he visited the Church of Nativity, where tradition says Jesus was born. Shutting out the unceasing demands imposed on him by his office, John Paul II prayed alone. But the trip was not purely spiritual. Here too was a political dimension. He visited Yad Vashem, the memorial in Israel to the 6 million Jews murdered by the Nazis, an act of contrition on behalf of the Vatican, which had, during the war, remained silent about the Holocaust. He also used the pilgrimage to build bridges with Muslim leaders, part of the Pope's long-standing efforts to foster greater understanding between religions. The first undeniable sign of the Pope's failing strength came in Slovakia, when he was unable to finish a mass in front of 200,000 believers. Vatican officials abandoned attempts to deny that Parkinson's disease was diminishing the Pope's powers. On his final visit to Poland, his frailty told the adoring crowds they'd not see him again. He'd come home to say goodbye. In October 2003, John Paul II celebrated the 25th anniversary of his papacy. Surrounded by the hierarchy of the Catholic Church, he achieved a long-held ambition, setting Mother Teresa on the path to sainthood. He installed 30 new cardinals, adding to the ranks of those who'd choose his successor and preserve his legacy. As his own health continued to fail, he joined pilgrims at the Shrine of Lourdes. He told those seeking relief from their ailments that he shared in their physical suffering, but described it as a burden that was part of God's wondrous plan. But it was a burden that finally proved too heavy to bear. Complications after a bout of flu depleted what was left of his once legendary strength, and a tracheotomy robbed him of the power of speech. As he looked down on the crowds gathered in St. Peter's Square on Easter Sunday, unable to address them for the first time in his long papacy, it was painfully clear that John Paul II's era was drawing to a close. On becoming Pope in 1978, John Paul had chosen as his personal motto the Latin words, totus tuus. They mean all yours. A fitting epitaph for a historic papacy and a remarkable man.
And of course, Alistair Bruce is still with us. Alistair, obviously we've been looking at what has been happening, and the inevitable obviously has occurred. There will now, won't there be, a lot of protocol and a lot of pre-arranged activities taking place. Talk us, if you would, through the procedure from this point on.
About 18 years into his papacy, the late Pope John Paul II produced a new constitution called Universi Dominici Gregis, and in it is laid out not only all the details about what should take place at his funeral, but also how his successor must be selected. And it is very interesting that already Joachim Navarro-Valls, who is the Vatican spokesman, has stood up and said, we will follow exactly what the late Holy Father directed. And now the Cardinal Camerlengo, who is the Chamberlain, has taken control of the church as a sort of part-time chief, and he will, with the cardinals, run it. But they can't do anything to alter what has been set in play by John Paul II, and they must leave it untampered with until the successor is elected.
There was a good deal of modernising done by the late Pope John Paul II, wasn't there? Not only did he modernise what you just talked about, but also the conclave of cardinals. That's the next stage in this procedure that's coming up.
That's right. He's altered it in the sense that the manner in which they vote, there are going to be 117 of them, because those are the number who are still under the age of 80. They will now, for the first 30 ballots, have to still choose with a 2/3 majority plus one in order to elect a pope. But if they still can't at that point, the change he made is that it'll be majority vote, i.e. 50% plus one, to try and end a deadlock if there was one. The longest conclave that ever took place in the 1200s went on for 3 years. So there is a great desire to make sure it is quick. But then recent ones have been quite quick, and the conclave to select the late John Paul II, 26 and a half years ago, took 7 ballots over 3 days. And we believe that in the first ballot, Karol Wojtyla, as he then was, only got 5 votes. And how amazing it was that in the process of the conclave, he then moved through 7 ballots to become the overall 2/3 plus selected candidate, which then, of course, made him possible to become Pope.
The first non-Italian Pope for 450 years.
That's right. It was an incredible thought that the Church had always and consistently elected Italians, and it shows how the Church has changed. It needed, at that point in 1978, somebody who could speak more widely, and that's exactly what John Paul II has done throughout his pontificate. He's been, because he was trained as an actor, he has had the capacity and courage to go out and communicate his mission around the world with incredible impact, as we were hearing in that obituary just now.
The date of the funeral as well is very specific, isn't it? Is this something which the Pope would have laid down, or do those now looking after the Church make that decision?
It was laid down in the Constitution. After either 4 or before 6 days after his death, we're now in the 2nd day, he must be laid to rest. And so that means we've heard already some suggestion that he'll be possibly buried on Wednesday or maybe on Thursday. We will find out in due course as more details are given, but the Camerlengo will prepare that along with the representatives who deal with ceremonial in the Vatican.
Indeed, because we think, for very obvious reasons, of the Pope as a religious figure, which indeed he was. But he isn't only that, is he? He's the last absolute monarch in Europe, and he has a Secretary of State. There is almost a national picture here, apart from his religious position.
Well, the powers of the papacy were established over history, and they are indeed sovereign powers, although the sovereignty in terms of territorial or temporal power are extremely minimum. And after Vatican II, which was a huge reforming period, Pope Paul VI came off his throne and took off his papal tiara, which is like a 3-coroneted crown, and laid it on the altar to demonstrate that no longer was he claiming great territorial powers and would never again, but would remain powerful like a medieval and powerful absolute monarch, but only over people's souls. And that is, I think, where this papacy has moved from where it was in the days of Jesus Christ, when, of course, St. Peter was the foundations of the Church. Through 2,000 years, we're now looking back over the last pontificate of John Paul II, who died yesterday, and seeing this complete turn back to simplicity. Now, of course, he lived in this massive pontifical palace, but in that massive pontifical palace, he held rooms just on the top floor that were simple in the extreme. Just a simple bed, and we were hearing in one of the comments made by somebody we talked to after the Pope died, how he as a cardinal had visited the Pope in the last 24 hours and saw the late Holy Father lying in this bed, everything white sheets, white blankets, and there was this very, very tired face with his bright blue eyes still watching that cardinal as he left the room. And this gentle idea of this powerful man, this strong constitution that he had, still leading him forward in the last days as he met his Maker.
Amazing to think, Alistair, that just on Easter Sunday, a few days ago, he was there at the windows of his apartment addressing the pilgrims in St. Peter's Square.
And how he struggled to get out the blessing at the end of the delivery of his message by another of the cardinals. And you could see the agony as he put his hand to his head and held it and minded desperately that he couldn't get the words out. And then 3 days later, on Easter Wednesday, he was there at the balcony again, and once again tried to speak but couldn't. And everybody who gathered to watch it, everyone who gathered to watch on March the 30th, the last Wednesday, to see him come to that window where they'd seen him week in, week out to deliver the Angelus at 12 o'clock every Sunday, and then to hear him unable to speak, just this agonizing croak as he tried to get the voice to work after the operations that he'd endured. But he was so determined to communicate in those last hours, and it was clear in all the expressions we got from his deathbed that he was trying to communicate all the time. I think I'll always remember this last sight of the Pope on the Wednesday that just passed, just a few days ago. A man who we've now lost, standing there where he had week in, week out to deliver the Angelus, making the cross. That was all he could do, but being very much with the people who'd come to watch him.
Alistair Bruce, for the moment, thank you very much indeed. Well, the bells, I should say, are tolling tonight at the Vatican to mourn the passing of Pope John Paul II as the world's 1.1 billion Roman Catholics begin 9 days of official mourning. Let's talk now to James Blears, who's a journalist in Mexico, for a reaction from Catholics in Central America tonight. James, thanks for joining us. As we were just saying, 1.1 billion Catholics across the world affected by events tonight, and just how has the news been received where you are?
Well, half of the Catholics in the world come from Latin America, and Mexico is the second largest Roman Catholic country in the world. People were expecting the Pope's death, but even so, it's a sense of shock, a sense of being stunned. Most people, Mexico is a young country, most of the population are under the age of 45, and so most of them have never known anything else apart from John Paul II as their Pope. Traffic slowed down, people just stood stunned in the street, many people cried. He visited Mexico 5 times on papal visits, and he always said, Mexico siempre fiel, always faithful. And people here felt privileged that he came. The gatherings when he did come were absolutely enormous. I was in the 3 of the visits here, and perhaps the most memorable one was the one before last, when 1 million people were in one field, or a huge expanse of field. There were just seas of people, and literally hundreds of coaches and vehicles. It took 5 hours to get out of that general area back into Mexico City. And an image that will always stay with me is of an Irish priest, rather sunburnt, because the temperature, people stood overnight in temperatures of, well, virtually 0, and the temperature had gone up to about the high 80s. It was a priest, an Irish priest, sunburned, and he was taking a confession from a young man. He was sitting on a steel chair, and the young man was kneeling on a piece of makeshift cardboard, and he was hearing the confession of this person. I think people all around the world have identified with him because he was not only the Pope, he was also a person who was so marvellous with people, especially with children as well. And often people in the crowds would put a child close to him, and he would always put his hand on the child's head or bless the child. The reaction here has been immense, and it's been very deep.
And the Archbishop of Mexico City, one of the cardinals that indeed may be involved in the next stage of events in Rome.
Norberto Rivera is the cardinal of Mexico City. He gave us, as recently as yesterday, a service in thanks and blessing of John Paul II, and then immediately got onto a plane to go to Rome to be involved in, obviously, the choice of a successor. It's very difficult to say who's going to be a successor to the Pope. It has to be remembered that Pope John Paul II is, I think, the only non-Italian Pope in something like 455 years. And so it's very difficult to know whether perhaps the Vatican is going to revert to an Italian or not. But Norberto Rivera has all the credentials. He's still relatively young. He's well under 70 years old, in fantastic health, and he is very conservative on many of the issues which face the Church. And he's also the leader of the second largest church or congregation of Catholics in the world. So these are powerful indicators in his favour, but it's very difficult to know what happens behind closed doors in the Vatican.
Well, as we watch these pictures coming to us live from the Vatican City in Rome, these amazing pictures of the Basilica around St. Peter's Square in Rome, we think of Catholics worldwide. And as we're speaking to you, James, tell us how Latin America will be feeling tonight and what will be going on in churches around where you are.
There will be services of thanksgiving for the life of the Pope throughout Mexico, in small, large churches, cathedrals all over. Mexico has thousands and thousands of churches, and it also has to be pointed out that more than 60% of the population of the country are classified internationally as poor people. There was an immense reaction when the Pope came last time, his last visit in 2002, although at that time showing the signs of Parkinson's syndrome or disease, and also very tired, very infirm, but he still made the effort, and he canonized an indigenous peasant from the 16th century, Juan Diego. And this was immensely important to the indigenous peoples of Mexico. Mexico has 10% of the population are indigenous people, so this was an enormously important event. It was done in the Basilica of Guadalupe. President Vicente Fox himself is a practicing Catholic, and as he was just before he was being inaugurated president, he went to the Basilica and celebrated Mass. This has never been done, ever, by a Mexican president, and it was frowned on in many circles, but not obviously by the people of Mexico, the ordinary people, or the church itself. So there's a great feeling of togetherness, a great feeling of sorrow, but also a number of people I've spoken to, just ordinary people, have said that in some senses they're glad that the Pope has passed away, because of obviously the tremendous illnesses that he had and the suffering that he had to go through. In his last visit to Mexico, the national anthem was played, the papal anthem was played, but then he sat down in a tired way. But then the Mexican national anthem was played, and he struggled to his feet again, and this brought tears to the eyes of many people.
Well, James, across Latin America tonight, obviously world leaders coming to pay their respects and paying tribute to the late Pope. The Bolivian president, we're being told, Carlos Mesa, declaring 3 days of national mourning in his country. The Chilean president, Ricardo Lagos, following suit and ordering his country's flags to be flown at half-mast. Funeral masses scheduled for the pontiff in Cuba, Guatemala and Honduras, where Cardinal Oscar Andrés Rodríguez Maradiago is mentioned as a potential successor as well. And in Britain, the Conservative Party is saying they're suspending campaigning for today, Sunday, as a mark of respect to the Pope's death. James, this the first non-Italian Pope to be elected to Rome in 450 years, a man who spoke many modern languages, a fact that endeared him to the people of Latin America, do you think?
Well, he did speak Spanish when he came here. He always spoke smatterings of Spanish to people. He communicated. This is the thing about the Pope that so many people have said, that the great, the mighty, the humble, that they felt that he communicated with them. He was a great communicator. Obviously, he was also a great traveller. I mean, more than 100 trips around the world, and a number of them to the United States, to Canada, to Mexico, to Brazil, to many countries within the Americas, and that's what made people feel so close to the Pope himself. It was the fact that he could communicate with people, and he didn't make them feel that he was grand. He made them feel that he was with them. Although it does have to be said that in many of his policies or doctrines as Pope, he remained very conservative. He thought this was important to keep the unity of the Church, especially in Latin America, because that's perhaps where some of the future of the Church lies.
James Blears in Mexico, thank you very much for your thoughts this evening.
Now let's recap on what we do know about the Pope's death and the arrangements for what will happen now. The Vatican said the Pope died in his apartments shortly after 8:30 this evening, British time. The Vatican said tonight the Pope's final hours were marked by uninterrupted prayer. A few details have been released of what happens now. The cardinals of the Catholic Church are to meet on Monday morning for their first congregation since the death of the Pope, and they will discuss details of his funeral. On Monday afternoon, the Pope's body is to be brought to St. Peter's Basilica, where it will lie in state. As to a date for a funeral, the Italian news agency ANSA is reporting that it will not happen before Thursday.
Well, your response as Sky News viewers to this evening's coverage has been amazing, quite honestly. We've been inundated with emails and text messages from you following the death of Pope John Paul II, all of you seeming to want to pay tribute to the late Pope and to give us your thoughts and feelings on how it's affected you. We'll start with Jason Wachila, an email from a relative of the Pope, Jason Wachila in Bristol. The world has lost a great saint, he said. He joins now my granddad, his cousin, and may they both rest in peace.
Sue Williams from Oswestry writes, "This great man has, through his death, converted me to the Catholic faith." An anonymous email, "Our dear Pope John Paul II has left this life, but his spirit will live on. God bless him."
Eunice messaged us to say, "May the saints you have canonised welcome another beautiful saint with open arms."
Tom from Paris says, "With the sad passing of the Pope, the world has not just lost a father of holiness, but a symbol of peace and love of God. It's sad that the Catholic Church and the world has lost one of the most amazing souls. I'm happy to have discovered briefly the Pope and the man Karol Wojtyła. Tonight a light has gone out. I wish him peace."
And Andrew Thomas Jenkins from Llanelli writes, "I've cried here watching Sky News tonight. The people of Poland must be desolate. I only hope they can take comfort in the fact that whilst he cared a great deal about his homeland whilst on earth, he'll do the same up in heaven. It's truly the end of an era."
And Alistair Bruce with us here in the studio. And Alistair, it's touching, really, isn't it? Not just the sheer quantity of emails we received, I think is about unprecedented. They're coming in at the rate of something like one a second or even more. But the universal sentiments that are being expressed.
Yes, another one that I was reading earlier on from an anonymous person. And it gives an idea of quite how widespread has been the impact of this amazing man. It says, "Being a Muslim, I am very saddened to hear that the Pope has passed away. May God, Allah, rest his soul." And I think that it's extraordinary that so many people have wanted to be associated and to reflect on how they feel at this time. And we look now with care and consideration at the plans that will be being made inside the papal palace at the moment. They will now be preparing to put into place all the responsibilities they have.
Pope John Paul II has lost his fight for life. One of the longest-serving popes, the 84-year-old, gave up his long battle with ill health shortly after 8 o'clock last night.
Well, tributes have been pouring in from world leaders and ordinary Catholics around the world in memory of a man who led the Catholic Church since 1978.
The picture, of course, is the scene tonight in the Vatican, the live pictures coming in. The crowds, which estimated up to around 50,000 people, most of whom have now dispersed, but clearly lights will continue to burn, and there will be many discussions now about precisely what will happen next. Those are the latest live pictures coming to us from the Vatican at the moment.
Well, earlier the Vatican spokesman Joaquin Navarro Valls, who has given many bulletins over the last few days and weeks about the deteriorating health of the Pope, spoke to reporters and the world one more time.
The Holy Father, John Paul II, died this evening at 9:37 in his private apartment. At 8 p.m. began the celebration of the Holy Mass, during which Viaticum was administered to the Holy Father, and once again the sacrament of the sick. All the procedures foreseen in the Apostolic Constitution Universi Dominici Gregis, promulgated by John Paul II on February the 22nd, 1996, have been activated.
Well, as we said, tributes are coming in from world leaders, and Here in the UK, Queen Elizabeth II has expressed her deep sorrow at the death of Pope John Paul II, remembering his efforts at promoting peace throughout the world. And she said, or rather her office said, the Queen has conveyed to the Holy See her deep sorrow on receiving the news of the death of His Holiness Pope John Paul II. And also, she said, Her Majesty remembers the untiring efforts of Pope John Paul II in promoting peace and goodwill, throughout the world.
Sky's Stuart Ramsey has been looking at the reaction in Rome to the news of the death of Pope John Paul II.
News of the Pope's death in his Vatican apartment spread quickly through Rome. The square beneath his official residence had been heaving with people throughout the day. This now, though, a moment to reflect on the passing of a papal reign that spanned a quarter of a century. They prayed and they clapped their appreciation of his very existence. Many here have known only John Paul II as their spiritual leader, and they led the way in praising his contribution to their lives. The young and the old, Catholics and non-Catholics alike, from all over the world.
People were singing, saying their rosary, they were singing together, and just the group feeling was very, very touching and moving.
Brilliant man who did a...
He's touched everybody, just touched everybody, for whatever faith. He was greatly loved.
It was a somber moment to be present at, to be honest. It was very, very moving. And it was a privilege to be there.
Thousands upon thousands of people are making their way to St. Peter's Square to pay their respects to the Pope. And while many of them would have known that it was inevitable he would die, there is still a profound sense of sadness here. Although there is that sadness, it is still very calm and very quiet. An official period of mourning for the Pope has already started. Stuart Ramsey, Sky News, at the Vatican City.
That official period of mourning, just the start of this 9 days of mourning now, and this period of ritual that we enter into now as a well-planned sequence of events is activated, in the words of the Vatican spokesman, and particularly the conclave of cardinals, which the Pope himself modernised before his death.
That's right. We know that the conclave must meet before 15 days have passed, but after the 9 days. So that is the area in which it must begin. Conclave means with a key, and it's because they meet in closed session. However, this Pope that we've just lost changed the routine. They used to meet in an area all around the Sistine Chapel and within the Sistine Chapel, and they were actually closed in, and they sealed the door and put a great big seal on it so that they couldn't get out, and food used to be passed in through a hatch. But the last time that will ever occur was when it took place in 1978 to elect the present Pope. Now what they have arranged is that there is a new hotel in the Vatican. It's like a hotel, it's a hostel. It's called the Santa Marta Hostel. And the cardinals will all live there. There's plenty of room, it's like a hotel, it's terribly comfortable, and they'll go by bus from the hotel to the Sistine Chapel that was built by Sixtus V in this incredible scenery set and painted by Leonardo da Vinci, and there they will consider and wonder as to which of their number will be selected to be the next Pope.
There's no stipulated, laid down time limit, is there, Alistair, on how long this conclave can continue its deliberations?
No, there isn't, but in order to make sure that it doesn't last forever like it always did, because the requirement was that there should be 2/3 majority plus one. And in ancient history, there always used to be huge influences at play, like the influences of sovereigns like the King of Spain versus the King of France. And this would really hold up the capacity of the cardinals to find a decision. There used to be many less of them in those days to actually deliberate. But now, of course, it's much, much more important to find a solution quickly. So after 30 elections, and there are about 2 or 3 a day, then they can go to majority voting. And that does make the whole thing a little bit easier.
And to ensure absolute secrecy and to rule out the influence of the outside world, there is that, if you like, metaphorical taping up of the door. There are no mobile phones allowed, And Pope John Paul brought these modernisations in when he became Pope, didn't he?
Well, he did, and he also put great sanctions upon the cardinals who are going to be part of the electing process not to communicate, and pointing out that it is a sin so to do, effectively. And there will be sweeping by modern technology to check that none of the rooms are being bugged, because everybody wants to know and will be interested to find out who is in the running, who is advanced and who is falling back. There will be lots of papabile, who are the people who are on the hot list, as it were, to be likely successors to the late John Paul II, who died yesterday. And everybody will be interested to know which one is likely to do well. So, ironically, the Vatican State, which is this tiny place where the Pope has ruled for so long, is the one place in the world that has more telephones per person than anywhere else in the world, will be the only place where nobody can communicate.
Alistair, the various nations, I'm thinking particularly of Africa, I'm thinking of South America, they are areas of the world which would dearly love, wouldn't they, to have one of their nationals as Pope. When will, I'm sorry to phrase it this way, but I think it's factual, when will the jockeying for position, the political manoeuvring begin?
Well, with dignity, relatively fast. There are two ways of jockeying. There is probably no way in which a cardinal can say, I'm very interested in being Pope, vote for me. That would be the end of his chances. But you will see very quickly as the cardinals come to Rome, they will, as part of the Novem Diales, these 9 days of mourning, be going to their titular churches all over Rome, because a cardinal has to have a parish, as it were, in Rome in order to be a cardinal. They will go to the pulpits and they will express, first of all, how marvellous John Paul II was, but in the way they say it, we'll start to get a sense of what they represent, and they will start to describe where it is the Church needs to go. And there again, we'll get a clue as to what they might put forward as an agenda. And it's the other cardinals who'll be interested, they'll be listening, and then they'll be talking when they get into the conclave. And that's when it'll all get interesting. But we will be outside trying to work it all out with apparently no information at all.
And I expect some of our viewers are wondering when we're going to mention the black and the white smoke. Take us through that procedure as well and what it means.
Well, I was mentioning that there are a number of different elective processes. There are different occasions, and each ballot, when each of the cardinals has voted, there will be 117 in the Sistine Chapel. They write on the document their name and who they vote for, and they write it down. Then they step forward to the altar, they place it on a paten, which is like a little dish, and then they lean it into a chalice, which is like a sort of cup. And then those votes are ceremoniously opened and counted, and then the announcement is made. And if there's no winner, they take those papers, they turn to the stove, or the stufa, which is set up at the back of the Sistine Chapel, and they are burnt. And they're mixed with a chemical now and some wet straw, and that produces dark smoke. And the crowd waiting outside, looking up at this tiny little, rather functional chimney coming out of the top of the Sistine Chapel, will know that no election has been made. But when they do choose from their number a pope, what will happen inside the Sistine Chapel is that that individual will be asked, are you prepared to be Pope? If he says yes, at that instant he becomes Pope. Then he's asked to choose his name. And at the same time, they'll take the ballot papers, go to the stufa, the stove at the back of the chapel, put them into the stove, and they will be mixed in such a way that they produce white smoke. And the anticipation out in St. Peter's will be enormous. And they still won't know who he is until he actually appears on the balcony before them.
And that changing someone's life pretty much forever.
Totally. And when the person is chosen, still dressed as a cardinal, he is taken away from the other cardinals to the left of the altar into what's called the Room of Tears. And in the Room of Tears are waiting 3 different sizes of papal robes. They have a little joke in Rome, in fact. They have small, medium and large, and Pope John the 23rd, because he was enormous. And they dress the Pope in the white robes before he comes out and receives the promise of dutiful service from all the other cardinals, the homage, and then he's taken to this incredible balcony, right in the centre of the great building of St. Peter's in Rome, and there he is presented them. Habemus Papam, we have a Pope. But for the moment, we don't have a pope, and we look back with sadness and reflection upon the life of John Paul II, who died only yesterday.
Indeed.
Alistair Bruce, thank you.
Well, there were emotional scenes worldwide, nowhere more emotional, very understandably, as in the Pope's hometown of Krakow. Lawrence Lee now reports from the city.
They are glorifying him here, as elsewhere in the world, and yet celebration of an extraordinary life seems utterly subsumed by a collective, overwhelming grief. At times it seemed like the whole of Krakow was in tears. They had had so much time to prepare themselves for this, and yet when the time came, they still seemed to have no way of dealing with it.
People are very sad. I saw a few people was crying, a lot of people was crying. And a few people, I think I saw a lot, lost the consciousness. It's very sad. Every people pray and pray.
They came out in vast numbers supporting each other. Under the Archbishop's palace, where he served and returned time and again to bless his people, the crowd swelled and filled every corner. Hardly anyone could bring themselves to speak. Physical pain was simply ignored, or perhaps not even noticed. They simply can't believe he's gone. He was their ideal in so many ways, not only as God's representative on earth, but as the man who lionized Poland throughout the 20th century against Nazism, against communism. He was our Pope, said one man to me tonight. There are no words. Which in turn leads to a new question of how this country, which has relied on his spiritual and his political guidance for so long, can now move on. And so they made for home to the sound they never wanted to hear, the cathedral bells ringing out, the news of John Paul's passing. Surely he wouldn't have wanted them to suffer so much on his behalf, but they will put themselves through it again today. Lawrence Lee, Sky News, Krakow in Poland.
Well, our reporter Rachel Ammett talking about the scenes in Krakow this evening as she was there, and Anna Botting saying that she also witnessed people falling to their knees upon hearing the news that indeed Pope John Paul II had died. We heard the news in London a good few minutes before they did, and we joined her just as they received that news, many of them falling to their knees and crying, one woman collapsing and emergency crews taking her away. A great deal of shock in the Pope's home country, and tonight many holding candlelit vigils across many cities to pray for his soul.
And of course, reaction from many people across the world. A little bit earlier this evening, the Archbishop of Westminster, the leader of Roman Catholics in this country, Cardinal Cormac Murphy O'Connor, gave his reaction to the Pope's death.
He was an extraordinary man, one of the greatest popes in the Church's 2,000-year history. We will remember him for his witness to hope and to the dignity of human life. We'll remember him for his extraordinary energy, for reaching across boundaries of religion and race. We'll remember him for his endurance of suffering, even to the very end. And we'll remember him, and I think the whole world should remember him, for reminding us tirelessly that this world is not the only world, that there's a world to come, our eternal destiny. Pope John Paul, as I have said, was an extraordinary man. And in remembering him, we remember that he stood for something very profound, that the light, and for him the light was Christ, was always at its brightest. When the darkness of the world seemed very, very deep. The Church will miss him. The world will miss him. And I will miss him. May John Paul, Pope John Paul II, rest in peace. Amen.
Well, the Italian Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi said yesterday evening, we're all grateful for the tireless work and suffering that the Pope bore incessantly against every form of totalitarianism, violence, oppression and moral degradation in the name of the values of the Catholic Church, and that are also the supreme values of human dignity and solidarity. And here in Britain, Tony Blair said that after Pope John Paul II died, that the world had lost a religious leader who was revered by Catholics and non-Catholics alike for his unflinching struggle for what he believed was good and right.
The Russian President Vladimir Putin called Pope John Paul II an outstanding figure of our times with whom a whole era is associated. That was in a statement released by the Kremlin press office. And President George W. Bush gave his reaction to the Pope's death.
Laura and I join people across the earth in mourning the passing of Pope John Paul II. The Catholic Church has lost its shepherd. The world has lost a champion of human freedom, and a good and faithful servant of God has been called home. Pope John Paul II left the throne of St. Peter in the same way he ascended to it, as a witness to the dignity of human life. In his native Poland, that witness launched a democratic revolution that swept Eastern Europe and changed the course of history. Throughout the West, John Paul's witness reminded us of our obligation to build a culture of life in which the strong protect the weak. And during the Pope's final years, his witness was made even more powerful by his daily courage in the face of illness and great suffering. All popes belong to the world, but Americans had special reason to love the man from Krakow. In his visits to our country, the Pope spoke of our providential Constitution, the self-evident truths about human dignity in our Declaration, and the blessings of liberty that follow from them. It is these truths, he said, that have led people all over the world to look to America with hope and respect. Pope John Paul II was himself an inspiration to millions of Americans and to so many more throughout the world. We will always remember the humble, wise, and fearless priest who became one of history's great moral leaders. We're grateful to God for sending such a man, a son of Poland, who became the Bishop of Rome and a hero for the ages.
Buckingham Palace has released this statement. The Queen has conveyed to the Holy See her deep sorrow on receiving the news of the death of His Holiness Pope John Paul II. Her Majesty remembers the untiring efforts of Pope John Paul II in promoting peace and goodwill throughout the world.
Tony Blair released a statement saying he had been a remarkable man. He said, the world has lost a religious leader who was revered across people of all faiths and none. He was an inspiration of a man of extraordinary faith, dignity and courage. He never wavered, never flinched in the struggle for what he thought was good and right.
A short time ago, the Conservative Party leader Michael Howard said a deep sense of loss would be felt by all faiths. He said, in a world of change and uncertainty, people saw him as a rock, steadfast in support of freedom, unswerving in opposition to totalitarianism, robust in defence of Christian values. The Catholic Church has lost a truly remarkable pope, and the world a great spiritual leader.
Well, just shortly after the news broke of the Pope's death, the Secretary-General of the United Nations, Kofi Annan, was one of the first to react. He said, I recall very fondly my meetings with him, particularly sitting with him in his private quarters discussing the question of war and peace. He was extremely concerned about the world we lived in, and like me, he also felt that in war we are all losers.
The Irish Prime Minister, Bertie Ahern, paid tribute to the Pope's efforts to secure peace in troubled parts of the world. I wonder whether all the changes would have happened in Eastern Europe if he had not been there for the last quarter of a century, he said. I don't think it would have. I think he had a powerful influence on that change.
Well, our religious affairs commentator, Alistair Bruce, is still with us in the studio here in London. And Alistair, the Queen, as head of the Church of England, of course, had to comment this evening on the Pope's passing, and she did so with great sorrow. What was the Queen's relationship with the Pope, and how did that change over his papacy?
Well, the Queen and Prince Philip had visited the Pope, first of all, in October 1980 in Rome. And she and Prince Philip had a normal audience, as heads of state are always accorded by the papacy. And it was significant because although the Queen has known most of the popes in her reign by communication, this was her chance to actually meet with him and get to know him. And then 2 years later, he came to the United Kingdom in 1982, when the country was actually involved in a war in the Falkland Islands. And of course it was a war between Britain and Argentina, a very strong Roman Catholic country. And not only was the Queen's son, Prince Andrew, involved in the fighting, but so were the sons and daughters of many other people in the United Kingdom. And of course the Pope trod a very difficult path in visiting a country at that time. The Queen's also visited him again out in Rome, and so she's had 2 audiences with him. And I think she gets to know people very well, and with her experience she can't fail to know the influence he's had, not only with the whole church, but in particular with Roman Catholics. And 2 members of her family, of course, converted to Roman Catholicism in the last 20 years. So the influence of Catholicism has grown, and I don't think she forgets that Henry VIII split with Rome when Clement VII wouldn't permit the divorce that Henry sought from his first wife, Catherine of Aragon.
Of course, they were both, in case of the Queen still is obviously, very much world figures, and both people who know very many world leaders and understand international politics. How much agreement or otherwise, Alistair, do you think there was between them on world events?
Well, I think, of course, the Queen's role is very much less influential because she's a sovereign figurehead. She's not a sovereign, dictatorially powerful, if he wants to be, Pope. I mean, the Pope was in a position of immense political or persuasive strength, and the Queen really was never allowed or permitted by our Constitution to do that. So I think the Queen would technically, I remember the Queen said once in her Silver Jubilee speech that when the bishop was asked what he thought about sin, he replied with simple conviction that he was against it. I think the Queen, when using that joke, completely understood that when she met somebody like the Pope or another religious leader, she would know that by instinct she was likely to be in favour of the moral leadership of one who is driven by faith, just as the Queen is driven by faith. But although the Queen is head of the Church of England, in no way would even she recognise that to be executive in anything like the sense the Pope was head of the Roman Catholic Church.
Alistair, the Pope's funeral, of course, taking place within the next few days. We're not quite sure when, but certainly day 3 or 4 we've been talking about. The Queen, as head of the Church of England, does have to send a representative to that funeral. And of course, we've already got the diary full on Friday. Prince Charles will be marrying Camilla Parker Bowles, and so most people booked up for this week, as it were. Who is likely to go and represent the royal family on such an occasion?
Well, Saturday, day 1, Sunday 2, Monday 3, Tuesday 4, 5, 6. The last day it's likely to take place is Thursday, and therefore on Friday, the day of the royal wedding, that would be a day after any delayed funeral.
Very tight,
so
isn't it?
It is quite tight. So I would imagine traditionally the Prince of Wales would have gone to represent the Queen. Whether or not he is asked to do that, it will depend upon the advice that the Queen gets from her ministers, and I'm sure that the Foreign Secretary will take advice from what we now have, which has happened only in the Queen's reign, is an ambassador to the Holy See, which never used to happen before. I mean, right back to Elizabeth I's reign, when the last link in that sort of term was ended, and so the Queen Elizabeth II's revived links with the Roman Catholic Church. And the Roman Catholic Church, remember, only had what we call the restoration of the authorities, or the restoration of the appointments, when the bishops were recreated in Britain in the 1860s, 1870s. So really Roman Catholicism has burgeoned since it came back into Britain and was able to show its head again rather more than it was during the rather dark ages post the Reformation.
Will the funeral itself, the ceremony, will it be anything like a state funeral in this country? I'm wondering what exact form it will take.
Well, it'll be very rigid according to the advice and strictures laid down by Universi Dominici Gregis, which is the constitution Pope John Paul himself had passed in his 18th year. Now, what it will be is completely different from a state funeral to the extent that it won't be so dramatic, it won't be so colourful in that there won't be military bands and things like that. What we will see outside the vast facade of St. Peter's will be a simple wooden box laid on the ground, on the earth, and on top of it, what? But just a Bible with its pages open. And when John Paul I, his funeral was taking place, the rain and the wind blew those pages side by side, and it was a very moving sight, the simplicity of it. So yes, it'll be grand in its size and in the enormous number of people who'll be there, but it won't be stately in the sense of the splendour of the pageantry of Great Britain or perhaps some of the other monarchies.
And before that funeral itself, of course, the Pope's body will be lying in state in St. Peter's as part of the 9 days of official mourning.
This time slightly different, because we are told he will be in his coffin when he lies in state. In the past, some popes were laid on a sort of a bier and were carried in their papal vestments through the crowds of St. Peter's and taken into St. Peter's itself, and they were carried and escorted by the Swiss Guard. So times have changed, but now in the simplicity of the funeral that we will see, the fisherman, St. Peter's representative on earth, the late John Paul II, who died yesterday, will be given the most dignified but magnificently well-attended funeral.
Alistair Bruce, for the moment, thank you.
Well, in the United States, many Catholics have been gathering outside St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York, the main Catholic church in America. Fox correspondent Rebecca Gomez is there. Rebecca, take us through, if you would, the scenes and indeed the reaction in your country.
Hi there, Alan. Yes, we had a special mass this evening officiated by Edward Cardinal Egan, the Archbishop of New York. It was standing room only. I tell you, this St. Patrick's Cathedral holds about 2,200 people, and it was filled to capacity. Every pew seat available gone. And in fact, there was a time when there was a line outside of St. Patrick's Cathedral, and people had to wait for others to come out before they were able to go in. Cardinal Egan, of course, saying that the late Pope John Paul II was a courageous and dedicated man, and that he lived his life as his Savior had lived his. And he said it was a time not just for mourning, however, but also to remember the great legacy of Pope John Paul II. All day, people have been filing in and out of St. Patrick's Cathedral, considered the center of the Catholic Church here in the United States, Alan.
Some rather evocative words actually coming to us here from the AFP, the French news agency. Flickering candles, they say, were lining every wall of St. Patrick's Cathedral. So I'd imagine it must have been quite a moving scene.
I'm sorry, Alan, can you repeat that? I can barely hear you a bit.
I understand. I was saying that the reports here saying that flickering candles were lining every wall of the cathedral. So I would imagine, Rebecca, quite a moving scene there.
Oh, definitely so. Very touching. People coming all day to sit in the pews to pray, people lighting candles. We talked to several people about their thoughts, their reactions to the Pope's legacy, to the Pope's passing. People saying that they admire him so much because he reached out to the young people of the world, and that he was very compassionate, and they admired his work in trying to bring people of all cultures, of all religions together. There is also a bronze bust of the pontiff at the entrance doors of St. Patrick's Cathedral in honor of his visit here to the church back in 1979, and we saw a lot of people pausing at that bronze statue, touching the face of the bronze statue in remembrance of the Pope. There was also a picture of the late John Paul II at the altar of the church during the service. So yes, a lot of people remembering a beautiful service, a beautiful sermon by Cardinal Egan tonight, Alan.
Rebecca Gomez, very many thanks for that.
So, Pope John Paul II, the man known as the People's Pope, has died at the age of 84. Born in Poland, he was the first non-Italian to head the Roman Catholic Church in more than 450 years.
He'll be particularly remembered for his world travel and his outspoken views against oppression and social injustice. Sky's Alex Rossi looks back at his life.
An image of what a pope should be, but it's an image created by John Paul II. Before him, pontiffs were largely remote, aloof figures confined within the walls of the Vatican. But John Paul II was a new pope for a new age. He became one of the most famous faces in the world, using his celebrity to further his mission as he visited more than 100 countries, circling the globe over 30 times. The desire to expand and protect the Catholic Church had its roots in hardship. Karol Wojtyła was born in the small town of Wadowice near Krakow. He spent his childhood in this house, now a museum. They were difficult years. His mother died when he was just 9. His brother 3 years later. In 1939, when he was in his late teens, his native Poland was invaded by the Germans. He'd already chosen to go into the church, but under the Nazi occupation had to conduct his studies in secret at an underground seminary. After the war, Poland became a communist country, and the young priest struggled to maintain his religion in an officially atheist state. Showing the determination that was to become his hallmark, he rose swiftly through the Catholic hierarchy. Nevertheless, his election to the papacy in 1978 was unexpected for a number of reasons. He was the first pontiff from behind the Iron Curtain, an appointment which sent shockwaves through the Soviet Empire. He was also the first non-Italian pope in over 400 years, and at 58, the youngest in a century. His relative youth and active lifestyle earned him the nickname God's Athlete. In the coming years, he was to draw heavily on these physical reserves. John Paul's papacy was almost ended in 1981 when a would-be assassin shot him in St. Peter's Square. An amateur cameraman captured the moment 4 bullets struck the pontiff. So grave were his injuries he received the last rites. His recovery was viewed by many as miraculous. John Paul put it down to divine intervention, claiming the hand of Our Lady guided the bullets away from his vital organs. He later went to prison to offer forgiveness to the man who'd tried to kill him. The Pope never regained his former physical strength, but resumed his work with undiminished determination. Never fearing controversy, he gave his full support to the fledgling Solidarity movement in his native Poland. When he returned home in 1991 after the fall of communism, it was to a hero's welcome. The Pope's commitment to peace was long-standing. On a trip to Ireland early in his papacy, and well before the peace process had got underway, he issued this appeal.
On my knees, I beg you to turn away from the path of violence and to return to the ways of peace.
When he visited the UK in 1982, he was the first Pope to set foot on British soil for 450 years, heralding a new era of interdenominational cooperation. South Africa was another country on the papal itinerary, but on his insistence only after the apartheid regime had been removed.
To say the visit is long overdue is to pay tribute to your own abhorrence of the system of apartheid.
More recently, he was at the forefront of opposition to the war against Iraq, telling both Tony Blair and President Bush it was a failure of humanity. But many who admired the Pope's commitment to political freedom were less impressed by his unyielding stance on matters of doctrine. His views on the ordination of women, abortion, contraception and homosexuality were unapologetically conservative. Many liberal Catholics regarded his reaction to the paedophile scandal which rocked the church in America as too little, too late. As he wrestled with the problems of making the church relevant in the new millennium, John Paul II embarked on a symbolic pilgrimage to the Holy Land. On the 2000th anniversary of the birth of Christ, he visited the Church of Nativity, where tradition says Jesus was born. Shutting out the unceasing demands imposed on him by his office, John Paul II prayed alone. But the trip was not purely spiritual. Here too was a political dimension. He visited Yad Vashem, the memorial in Israel to the 6 million Jews murdered by the Nazis, an act of contrition on behalf of the Vatican, which had, during the war, remained silent about the Holocaust. He also used the pilgrimage to build bridges with Muslim leaders, part of the Pope's long-standing efforts to foster greater understanding between religions. The first undeniable sign of the Pope's failing strength came in Slovakia, when he was unable to finish a mass in front of 200,000 believers. Vatican officials abandoned attempts to deny that Parkinson's disease was diminishing the Pope's powers. On his final visit to Poland, his frailty told the adoring crowds they'd not see him again. He'd come home to say goodbye. In October 2003, John Paul II celebrated the 25th anniversary of his papacy. Surrounded by the hierarchy of the Catholic Church, he achieved a long-held ambition, setting Mother Teresa on the path to sainthood. He installed 30 new cardinals, adding to the ranks of those who choose his successor and preserve his legacy. As his own health continued to fail, he joined pilgrims at the Shrine of Lourdes. He told those seeking relief from their ailments that he shared in their physical suffering, but described it as a burden that was part of God's wondrous plan. But it was a burden that finally proved too heavy to bear. Complications after a bout of flu depleted what was left of his once legendary strength, and a tracheotomy robbed him of the power of speech. As he looked down on the crowds gathered in St. Peter's Square on Easter Sunday, unable to address them for the first time in his long papacy, it was painfully clear that John Paul II's era was drawing to a close. On becoming Pope in 1978, John Paul had chosen as his personal motto the Latin words, totus tuus. They mean all yours. A fitting epitaph for a historic papacy and a remarkable man.
Well, now that the Pope's death has been announced, a process is set in motion during which he is mourned and buried, and a successor is then elected. Well, first of all, this man, Cardinal Eduardo Somalo, the Camerlengo or Chamberlain of the papal household, confirms the death with the support of a notary. Traditionally, he calls the dead Pope's baptismal name, Karol Wojtyla, 3 times, whilst tapping him on the forehead with a small ceremonial silver hammer. There's no post-mortem at this stage. The Camerlengo then arranges for the papal study and his bedroom to be sealed, and he orders the destruction of John Paul II's fisherman's ring and his personal lead seal that he uses on letters. A 9-day mourning period then ensues, known as the Novem Dialis begins. First, the Pope's body lies in state inside the Clementine Hall of the Apostolic Palace at the Vatican. It'll be visited by cardinals and diplomats, and as each person passes by, they'll kiss John Paul's foot. Then the body is moved to St. Peter's Basilica, where it lies in state until the funeral itself. Members of the Sacred College of Cardinals have about 20 days to get to Rome in order to elect the next pope. That'll be the 265th, and they'll form what's called a conclave in the Sistine Chapel. The word conclave deriving from the Latin for with keys, signifying the absolute privacy that cardinals must have for their deliberations. Well, the new pope is then elected by secret vote. Ballot papers are placed in a special bowl, At the end of each round, the ballot papers are burned in a stove, the stufi, at the back of the Sistine Chapel. Then black smoke shows a vote has been inconclusive. That means cardinals must rethink, renegotiate, pray and vote again. But white smoke means a new pope has been chosen.
Seems almost in a way disrespectful, doesn't it, Alistair, to be talking about the next pope when we've only just lost the pope. Yet there must, I'm sure, in the Vatican be people with this in their minds because they have a duty.
In a sense, this is the 264th time that there has been the need to choose a new successor to St. Peter. And therefore, it continues a tradition. And it's perfectly normal for the Church that has now lost its shepherd to want to make good preparations according to the instructions laid down to find a new one.
And this is an age-old tradition. The white smoke and the black smoke is something which has been so much in people's minds over so many years. There's a huge symbolism to it, isn't there?
Well, principally the idea was originally to try and give the crowd a sense that when the correct vote had been made, in that the Holy Spirit had been able to work and produce a successor, then the white smoke, which represents purity, would come out of the chimney. But of course, the previous ballots needed to be burnt as well. They're all very, very carefully gathered and burnt, and they needed to always make the crowd aware that it had not been successful and put a special... Well, what they did is they put wet straw in with what needed to be burnt, and that tended to make the smoke go very black. But they had a problem in 1978 because it came across all badly and it just looked wrong, and so when the smoke came out they didn't always identify what was white and what was black, so they're going to use a different chemical, I'm told, this time in order to make absolutely certain that white is white and black is black.
That really is very interesting, because I think we think of the smoke, if we're a little bit ignorant, we think of the smoke as something which is simply produced to tell us whether they've been successful or not. But there is, from what you're telling us, a very real requirement. It is actually the burning of the ballots for a very practical purpose, to make sure nobody knows who has voted for whom.
That's right, they want to keep it entirely secret. However, if there appears to be a very narrow division between one and another, they can check that the individual who might win has not voted for himself.
Or surely he wouldn't.
Well, one would assume that he wouldn't, but you've got to remember that in history, achieving the papacy was absolutely the most... it's the most desirable thing to get in the world once, because the power was so considerable.
Sufficiently desirable for people to cheat in those days?
Oh yes, because there was great wealth attached to it, and there was a period in the papacy when it was all about wealth. And that, in a sense, particularly with the building of St. Peter's, the Basilica and the palaces beside it, the incredible expense that the popes went to live in a grand style, created the situation for the Reformation, which led to many people in the European countries choosing to protest against the Roman Catholic doctrine, and they became Protestants, and it created a schism in the Christian church. So nowadays, of course, it's a completely different issue, and the papacy that has been vacated by the late John Paul II, who died late yesterday, is now a very simple but very powerful and yet very honourable post, and it has many titles, and the title that the successor will take on will be Pope or Supreme Pontiff or Bridge Builder. He will be the Vicar of Christ, he will be the Bishop of Rome, but more than anything else he will be the servant of the servants of God. And I think that's what John Paul II, in his 26-year papacy, tried to encompass most.
Very, very interesting indeed, Alistair. Thank you.
Well, you're watching Sky News and continuing coverage of the death of Pope John Paul II. The Pope passed away in his apartments in the Vatican shortly after 8:30 yesterday evening.
The Vatican said the Pope's final hours were marked by uninterrupted prayer. The cardinals of the Catholic Church are to meet on Monday morning for their first congregation since the death of the Pope, and they will discuss details of his funeral.
On Monday afternoon, the Pope's body is to be brought to St. Peter's Basilica, where it will lie in state. Official mourning for the Pope will last for 9 days.
Pope's funeral is expected to take place next week. Italian media sources suggesting either Wednesday or Thursday, but the Vatican has not confirmed a day. The conclave to elect a new pope is to start within the next 15 to 20 days. Let's bring you the latest pictures we have from Poland, Wadowice, where the Pope was born. And of course, as we were reporting earlier, and very understandably, some of the most fervently felt emotion in the Pope's own homeland of Poland. We saw Krakow, we saw the cathedral, and people at that time having a rather perhaps different demeanour from those in Rome. It seemed from what our colleagues there were telling us that people in Rome were reflective and accepting that the Pope's final hours were drawing very near. Those in his own city of Poland were praying more for a miracle and hoping even at such a late stage that the Pope perhaps could rally, perhaps could pull through, and maybe his health would change for the better. So a lot, understandably, of emotion in Poland.
Well, as we see those breathtaking shots of the Basilica overlooking St. Peter's Square in Rome, we can tell you that when Pope John Paul II was elected to the papacy in 1978, it was his sporting prowess that earned him the nickname God's athlete.
His fitness and his vigour helped him survive the attempt on his life in 1982 and continue with a gruelling schedule of papal duties.
But, as you've seen in recent years, the burden this all placed on his well-being became all too obvious. Sky's health correspondent Thomas Moore examines Pope John Paul II's medical history.
Una bandiera di contraddizioni.
The Pope suffered from a litany of health problems, and in recent years he had looked increasingly frail. A few weeks after celebrating Christmas Mass, he suffered a bout of flu, and subsequent breathing difficulties proved too much. His slide into infirmity began with a near-fatal assassination attempt in May 1981. One bullet passed through his abdomen, another just missed his heart. He survived after major internal surgery. A decade later, in 1992, the Vatican announced the pontiff had a tumour the size of an orange in his intestines. It was removed in an operation at Rome's Gemelli Hospital. But just a week later, he appeared at his hospital window, and after a short period of convalescence, he returned to his duties. He had rallied once again.
He had amazing traction to continue to pull on, to move on, to recover, to gain his fitness, and even then, towards his final years, to cope with immense disability while being a very powerful advocate for the spiritual values which he believed in so strongly.
But the health scares were never far away. In 1994, he broke a leg after falling in the bath. 2 years later, he suffered repeated abdominal pains. There were fears that his colon cancer had recurred, but doctors diagnosed a grumbling appendix. While in hospital, he put his own ill health to one side to comfort sick children. But his sense of duty took its toll.
He wakes up, at 5, 4 in the morning. He conducts himself throughout the day as a pontiff should, and he travels. He travels around the globe, like a jet setter. I think that the physical aspect of his papacy has really placed an enormous burden on him, and for his own sake, perhaps he should have thought of stepping down.
For many years, the Pope suffered from Parkinson's disease and arthritis, which grew progressively worse. At Lourdes last year, his speech was slurred. Less visible was the debilitating effect the disease had on his breathing muscles. When he succumbed to flu and suffered a throat infection, he needed an emergency procedure to help him breathe. He recovered, but a fortnight later, he was back in hospital. This time for a tracheotomy, in which doctors created a breathing hole in his throat. It was a sign that his health was continuing to deteriorate.
He had rebounded from medical problems many times, but this was a challenge too far.
Well, Alistair, Bruce, the Pope's health, it was amazing, wasn't it? The way he continued with really grueling world trips. I can remember on one occasion, he obviously was so used to kneeling down and kissing the ground of any new land he visited. There was one time when he actually couldn't, his body wouldn't allow it, and they brought the turf to his lips to meet him halfway.
He tried so hard at Lourdes once when he went to the Shrine of Our Lady there, and he just simply couldn't, as you say, agonizingly he tried.
He did try.
Because that was always his way. I mean, this is a pope who travelled more than any other. He also, as the third longest serving successor, as it were, had such a tremendously determined mind about travelling. He wanted to see everything. For instance, I mean, during his life, despite the declining health, and using things like the Pope-mobile, which was such a creative development. I mean, we were used to seeing popes going in the Sedio Gestatoria, which was this seat carried by, do you remember, held up high, and he was carried around in the seat. And
sort of sedan chair.
Yes, there used to be two great big fans behind him to demonstrate his power. And all those sort of symbols of authority were got rid of in Vatican II, which was the Second Vatican Council, to try and simplify the papacy. And so John Paul II made sure that he could do a great deal more travelling around. And I remember just seeing how diminished he was on the 30th of March, when he appeared at the window of his apartments and tried so desperately to give the blessing himself. He couldn't. Somebody else's voice needed to be used, but there he was, using his hands in the famous papal blessing. Now, the papal blessing is 3 crosses. Only the Pope can do 3 crosses. And that is what you get from a Pope in a papal blessing, which will be at the last that we saw in public, the first being when he was elected in 1978, when he came to the great balcony at the centre of the front of St. Peter's. And St. Peter's standing there now, vacant, the great basilica itself, which is where he started his papacy, and it looks so magnificent, all lit up. The papacy is without its
Let's show that
pope
nice shot
at the
now,
moment.
because we've got a beautiful shot coming in from Rome, as you're referring to there, Alison. That's what you're talking about, the grandeur, the majesty, really, of that picture.
Exactly. And if you look at the front of that vast building, just above the huge door in the centre at the front is a darkened door with a small balcony in front of it. And that is where the Pope first appeared to the vast congregation or people who were waiting. Just to the right of St. Peter's facade there, in the dark shadows beyond, you can just make out a small V of a distant roof. That is the Sistine Chapel. And that is where all the cardinals will come and where they will make their next choice for the successor to St. Peter. The throne of St. Peter, which was given up only a few hours ago by John Paul II at the end of his 26-year pontificate.
Looking at those pictures of him, just filmed a few short days ago, the 30th of March, as we were saying. It was that evening, Thursday night, when his condition suddenly deteriorated, wasn't it? He had a high fever caused by an infection of the urinary tract. He was suffering from terrible breathing problems, exacerbated by the progress of Parkinson's disease, an incurable condition from which he suffered, and which the Vatican tried to shield his followers from for so many years, and yet it was apparent to everybody he was clearly suffering from Parkinson's. Why did the Vatican try to hide that from pilgrims?
I think initially they wanted to protect him and to enable him to feel strong. I think it's always said that it's important to make someone feel strong. He was a strong man, and to see his strength diminish must have been an agonizing fact for him. But then he, in his strength, decided that one of his roles as leader, I think, was to demonstrate the dignity and the frailty through dignity of old age. And really, I think it's very much a factor now that of all the things we as a society fail to acknowledge and respect and to hold as a very public aspect of our lives is old age. and to recognise that in the frailty of old age there is immense dignity, there's a wealth of wisdom, and there is something that we need to protect and to venerate. And he chose to lay before us in the latter months of his life exactly the agony and pain he was dealing with, and he did it with such dignity.
And following on from that, Alistair, if you can possibly put into words for us now, the level, if I can choose my words very carefully, of some sort of joy that there is now as he passes on, and the next phase begins. Do you know what I mean?
I do completely. It's exactly the word that a good Christian soul would feel, because we're sad, we miss him, we will miss him, and we will mourn him. But as a Christian, we must understand, or Christians will understand, that he enters into eternal life. And that is what's so special today.
Alistair Bruce, thank you very much indeed. Well, we've been receiving thousands of emails from you, literally thousands of emails and texts in the few hours that have passed since Pope John Paul II died just after 8:30 London time this evening. I can tell you that Lynn from Glasgow was one of those. She wrote to us to say, "The world has lost its most special human being. The Pope united many religions in his quest for peace." And the Turner family also decided to email us, and they said, "We're not Catholics, but we loved John Paul II for everything he stood for. He's a true saint. The world will never be the same without him." Nick from East Sussex also took the trouble to contact us. He said, "A true example of what humankind should be. He will be forever respected." And of course, Ireland, our viewers in Ireland weren't to be left out. Deirdre from Ireland has fond memories of the Pontiff. She says, "You touched my heart when you came to Ireland in 1979. I will never forget you." Karen in Aylesbury emailed us to say, "Heaven's gates have opened for a truly blessed soul." And Brian in Derry in Northern Ireland says, "A beautiful life has come to an end. The Pope died as he lived, everyone's friend. God bless you, Holy Father." The Catholic Church must be very proud to have such a wonderful father. May he have eternal life. He was truly inspirational. We've had literally thousands of emails and particularly text from you this evening paying tribute to the great man who died today. 1 minute to 2 o'clock. You're watching Sky News coming to you live from London with continuing coverage of the death of Pope John Paul II. The Pope passed away in his private apartments in the Vatican shortly after 8:30 yesterday evening. In a statement, the Vatican said the Pope's final hours were marked by uninterrupted prayer from those around him. A Requiem Mass for the Pope is to be said in St. Peter's Square at 9:30 British time. That's our time tomorrow morning. And the Cardinals of the Catholic Church are to meet on Monday morning for their first congregation since the death of the Pope to discuss details of his funeral.